Again, for my talk today, I'm going to focus on the use of drones or unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, as a tool for mapping, tile drainage. Okay. Oh, thanks. Hear me better now. Okay. Well, what's the rationale for doing this kind of work? Well, I'll start off with a statistic here. In a 1985 economic survey of the Midwestern United States, at that time they have 12.5 million hectares, or about 31 million acres in farmland containing subsurface drainage. And so why do we want to be able to find where these drainage pipes are? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is more economic and the other's more environmental. So we'll start with the economic reason first. First, let's see. The economic reason, one of the things we want to oftentimes make enhancements, modifications, or repairs on existing subsurface drainage systems. For example, putting in new draining lines in between the existing draining lines to improve soil water removal efficiency and thereby improving crop yields. Before you can do something like this, you need to know where the old drain lines are. Also, even better, besides finding where the old drain lines are, if you're going to retrofit the system, having some information on the surface topography. And this is something else that we can get from UAV imagery. So the second reason is more involved with the environmental considerations. For a watershed scale risk assessment of nutrient, nitrate, and phosphate release into the environment from subsurface drainage systems, what you really need is general information on the presence and intensity of subsurface drainage practices over large agricultural areas. So what we need is maps of these subsurface drainage systems. And problem is that a lot of these maps have long since, been lost. Even systems that were installed, as little as 15 or 20 years ago, the maps are no longer available. So what are you doing presently to be able to find these drainage pipes? Well, the traditional methods, which tend to be very tedious, time-consuming, and often cause, damage to the drainage pipes themselves. The first one is using a tile probe to find the pipes. It requires a lot of finesse to kind of know when you insert the probe into the soil if you're encountering an actual pipe or a rock. And it can take a lot of time to really figure out what that pattern of the drainage is in a field. I mean, you could spend all day trying to figure out, especially a complex pattern, how those drainage pipes are oriented. The other alternative is commonly used is just putting trenches in the field, and that works great. You'll find where the pipes are, but you're going to cause damage to pipes as you go along, requiring repair and then backfill of the trench itself. So I think we need more non-destructive, effective, and efficient methods for mapping drainage pipes. I will mention quickly, just a few slides, another method that's been tried, and in a lot of scenarios it works very well, and that's using ground-penetrating radar to find the drainage pipes. Here, the concept is you're just sending a radar signal on the ground, it bounces off the pipe, the signal returns to the surface where it's recorded, and then you use these recorded signals to produce a couple of different products. You can use the GPR radar data to produce how it sees the soil profile beneath the surface, the transects along which the GPR data is collected. You also produce GPR amplitude maps, and that's basically the reflected radar energy from a particular depth interval. Either one, you see, you look for responses in the profile, these upside down U-shaped features, or in the maps, these linear features that are indicative of where the pipes might be present. You can increase the efficiency of GPR by integrating it with real-time kinematic global navigation satellite systems. Whether that, first of all, your roving GPS antennas is integrated directly with your GPR unit, and then you will have either a physical base station, or you can use a virtual base station network such as provided by the Ohio Department of Transportation or several of the other states in the Midwest. And that increases your efficiency quite a bit. So what that allows you to do is that here's our profile, GPR. You can see our responses to the pipes. With the GPS, we get our latitude, longitude coordinates. And then we can plot this on an aerial, on a map or an aerial image. Say this is our yellow line of our transect. Again, the red dots are our interpretations of where the drainage pipes are. We map those out also in the aerial image. And say if we use a circular or spiral pattern or a serpentine pattern, plotting out where our drainage pipe responses that we got off GPR, where they're line up, we probably have a drainage pipe. So that's kind of what we can do with GPR. And this is how it actually works in a couple of examples. These next two examples are 30-acre fields. First one is in Beltsville, Maryland. Again, our yellow lines are just where our transects were. All our red dots is where we came across GPR responses to drainage pipes. Then you just go ahead in here and connect up the dots. And you kind of figure out what your drainage pipe system is. Here it's a herringbone pattern. Again, this was like a 30-acre field. Another 30-acre field near Pataskala, Ohio. Here, what we're seeing is, again, our yellow lines are the transects. Red dots are where we had GPR drainage pipe responses. Connect up the dots, and what we see is drainage pipes that are extending into the field, from both the east side and from the south. So that's kind of what GPR can do, and it works pretty good on certain scenarios. Well, where the problem comes in is that even if you took ground penetrating radar, you mounted the GPR antennas on a sled and pulled it behind a ATV, the best you can do is probably, in a period of one day, cover at most maybe a 50-acre field. That's doing really good. So what we need is some other kind of technology that's going to be able to deal with fields that are much larger than that. And here, this is where drone UAV surveys that collect visible, near-infrared, and thermal infrared imagery may have a lot of potential for mapping drainage pipe systems in fields larger than 50 acres. And it'll work just as well in fields that are much smaller than 50 acres too. So it's pretty flexible. A little bit of general information about UAVs before we go on to some results that we got with using the drones to map pipes. Basically have two different types of drones that you're normally dealing with. You have the first type up here is a multi-rotor type drone, kind of a helicopter type drone that you've seen a lot of. And the other kind is kind of a fixed wing. There's advantages and disadvantages of both types of drones. And these are the two drones that we have in our possession for this kind of research. But we're going to focus on the fixed wing drone in terms of mapping the drainage pipes, what we've done over the last year or so. A little bit of what the advantages and disadvantages are of the two different kinds of drones. The multi-rotor allows you to take vertical and takeoff and landing, and that's really good. The other kind of a disadvantage of it is that the flight times are shorter and it can't cover as much distance. Advantage, it's very maneuverable. If you needed to follow a path along a stream or drainage ditch, it works really well for that. And it tends to be a little bit less expensive. Now, the fixed-wing drone, one of its big disadvantages is takeoff and landing because you need a corridor. And in that corridors you're coming in or taking off, you need to make sure that you don't have obstructions in place. So it's a little bit more work finding the corridors so that you can take off and land properly without crashing into something, which is not good. So the advantage, though, is that you can cover large areas and you have a longer flight time. We can easily cover in a single flight, 200 acres, on a good day when it's not too windy. The another maybe disadvantage would be it's more expensive. So this system, with all our different cameras, I'd say costs us around $50,000. This system here, it has dual gimbal mounts for both a thermal and a multispectral camera, is probably running about $25,000, only about half the price. So those are things to kind of take in consideration for what you're using your drones for. Okay, the UAVs commonly employed, these are broadband or multispectral sensors that obtain images in visible, near-infrared, and thermal infrared. There are other sensors available out there that are not as commonly used, like there are some LiDAR sensors that can be mounted on drones, hyperspectral sensors for very narrow band, lots of different wavelengths. They're now doing testing on geophysical sensors, even mounting like ground penetrating radar and electromagnetic induction, but that's kind of more in the future. But say a few years from now, you're going to see a lot more different sensors. But right now, you're mostly broadband multispectral imagery that gives you visible through near infrared and thermal infrared is what's most common. Okay, well, why would drone imagery work for finding drainage pipes? Well, there's kind of a scenario that you can kind of look for where it can possibly give you some good results in terms of where the pipes are. And that's say a couple days or so after a really big rainfall event. And what happens after a couple days after a big rainfall event is the soil directly over the drain line drains out and dries out first, and the soil between the drain lines remains wetter. So what you'll see in this graph here is that there's a greater amount of reflected like visible and near-infrared radiation in dry soils than are in wet soils. So directly over the drain lines, if it's going to be drier, you get a higher reflectance, kind of lighter shaded features. If you see these linear lighter shaded features, that may be indicative of a drainage pipe. The other thing is that because you have these water content differences over the drain line versus between the drain line, and because of the specific capacity of water, you're going to have probably temperature differences over the drain line versus between the drain line. And this is something that can be picked up by thermal infrared imagery. You'll have a difference in maybe the emitted thermal energy over the drain line versus between the drain lines. Again, the over the drain lines will show up on the image as being warmer, a lighter shaded warmer feature, as opposed to between the drain lines. So again, you're looking for these linear features regardless of whether you're looking at visible, near infrared, or thermal infrared imagery. This is an example. This is a color infrared image obtained in Illinois. That's basically a combination of green, red, and near infrared bandwidths. And again, I think you can see these linear features of some random pipes that show up pretty well. Okay, what was our research focus over the last year? And then towards the end of the talk, I'll mention where we're going from here. Is that basically we just got the equipment and we wanted to get it out as much as possible to test it at a number of different field sites. So we've gone to at least over 20 field sites in Iowa, Ohio, and Michigan. And we used we had 3 different cameras, a broadband visible camera that's RTK GPS compatible. We have a multispectral camera that we're using that has green, red edge, and near-infrared bandwidths. The red edge, if you're not familiar, is just that bandwidth that's right close to where red and near-infrared are on the EM spectrum. And then we had a thermal infrared camera. So when we went out to a site, we really had to fly 3 different surveys, one with each camera. So again, we're just trying to collect as much data at different sites without really paying attention to trying to being out there at the right time, say a few days after a rainfall event. And even under a less ideal approach, we found out that, of all the sites we visited, we were able to find, or see drainage pipe responses in over 50%. And again, that's with not a very ideal approach, not trying to get out there at a right time after a rainfall event. We had locations where we went out there, it's been dry for 2 weeks, and other sites where we actually went out where we had crop cover established. Just trying to collect as much data and see how well the equipment worked. So let's go into some results that we got where I thought it was more successful, and kind of give you an overview of the kind of data that we get and the responses that we get. Before showing you the drainage pipe mapping, I'd mention also one of the nice things about this technology, especially one of our cameras is an RTK visible camera, so that with photogrammetry type methods, we can go ahead and produce a really almost survey grade accuracy topo map of the field also, which could be useful if you're retrofitting a system. Having that topographic information would be helpful in putting the new pipes in place. So this is an additional piece of information that you're also going to get. I kind of want to mention what the accuracy is compared to what most people would call survey grade accuracy. Up here is probably survey grade accuracy, where horizontally you're within a 1 centimeter and vertically 2 centimeters. Whereas with our USDA-ARS photogrammetry, we're pretty close. Probably we're getting close to the horizontal accuracy of 3 centimeters and vertically, 5 centimeters. So we can produce pretty good topo maps, especially if we're out there under bare, field, soil conditions. Now, when you have vegetation in place, of course, something like LiDAR would work much better, but there's plenty of opportunity between harvest and planting to get out and collect this kind of data, which is also probably the best time to be out trying to map drainage pipes too. So you're going to get this as a secondary product which is kind of useful. I just wanted to mention that. This is just an example. This is near Mount Gilead. This is a digital surface model. The reds and the oranges are high elevations. You're getting into yellows, greens, and blues. Those are the low elevations. So you can take that and then produce just a contour map of the field that can be used could be even used for installing a new drainage pipe system, but certainly if you're retrofitting a system and putting in new drain lines in between the old ones. So that's some additional useful information that you get. So I want to talk a little bit now about kind of what our results are going to be. And these are some thermal infrared imagery results for a site near Mount Gilead, Ohio. That's the same site that we showed in the previous 2 slides where we had the topography. Shown here is just a Google Earth image, map. And I just want to point out we had 2 different subsurface drainage zones. Drainage zone 1, probably installed back in the 1980s, and is just some north-south drain pipes going through that area. And then a more complex system, this drainage zone 2, that was installed back probably about 2006. And you can even see in the Google Earth image, you have east-west and north-south pipes confirmed by the actual drainage system map. So last year in May, we went out and mapped this field with drone surveys, and this is the results from the thermal infrared imagery. And I'm not sure, might be kind of hard for you to see, especially in the back. If you look closely, you can see the north-south pipes in drainage zone 1 that show up pretty well. And also, if you were to look closely, you'd see the east-west and north-south drain lines showed up pretty well in drainage zone 2. And then with this area here, showing up as being empty with pipes. So it worked pretty good here, the thermal infrared imagery for, mapping the drain lines. I wish this was maybe a little bit brighter. That would show up the linear features better. But if you were close by and could look at that, you'd see the patterns, really well. So I apologize for that. This is another site, thermal infrared imagery, obtained near Defiance, Ohio. Especially look at the eastern part of the field. You can see the linear features show up really well. And the farmer here was also a drainage contractor that had put all these drainage pipes in place. And we looked at this, and he told me that this was all just spot on in terms of how he designed the drainage system in that field. And even on the west side, these you can kind of see some of these northwest, southeast lines. Those were drain lines he'd also put in. So they showed up again, pretty well. This is kind of an interesting site. This is in northwest Iowa, near a town called Spencer. Now, right here, this is our as-built drainage pipe map, and outlined in red is the area that we surveyed, with our drones. Again, using both the visible and the multispectral, with the 4 bandwidths, green, red edge, near infrared, and also the thermal infrared imagery. You can see this thermal infrared imagery, there's nothing there that really shows up in terms of pipes. You can't see much of anything. Well, what happened was the day after this, and it had been pretty dry, the following morning they had a rainfall event, which was around the county, close to about 3 inches, that happened over a period of 2 hours. So it was a huge event, a lot of flooding. So I hung around for another day and went back out to the same field and surveyed it again. So we've had more than 24 hours for drainage to occur, especially over the drain lines. And what you see is a kind of a totally different response. You can pick up, again, if you look closely and compare the two, we see the linear features of the drainage pipes that show up. Some of them coming this way. They turned up really well. So timing is really important. Again, being there the right time, maybe after a rainfall event, there's a good chance you'll maybe be able to see the drainage pipes a lot better than, say, that day before when it had been pretty dry. So again, what I want to emphasize is timing can be critical, and that's one of the things we're going to be looking at closely this coming year. This is a site near Chillicothe, Ohio, that it was collected in late May, and for a couple weeks hadn't had any rainfall at all. It was just really dry. Weren't expecting to find any pipe responses at all. But we're kind of surprised in that And it's kind of hard to tell. If you look at here, you see a lot of north-south features that are really just the response of field operations. But if we enlarge certain areas, besides these north-south features, we started picking up these subtle kind of northwest-southeast features. And those, fit in, tied in totally with the drainage pipe map. So even though they were subtle, we were able to map the drainage pipes, in that field. No, there were no crops in that field at that time. I will say that the previous slide from Iowa, I mentioned that it had corn and soybean residue, but you just had some of the crops just barely becoming established, just coming up, not complete cover or anything. And in the previous one from Mount Gilead, that was, again, before, it was just as crops were becoming established. But we had both corn and soybean residue in place. So sorry I forgot to mention that, because that's, ground cover I think is something we have to look at a lot in the future in terms of figuring out when it does and doesn't work. Last few images I've been pointing out that thermal infrared imagery seem to work pretty good, but in not all cases. Probably of all the cameras or sensors, it was probably the one that worked the best most of the time, but not always. Some of the multispectral imagery was better in many cases, where it was the green, red edge, or near infrared bandwidths. So you cannot always just say, well, let's just stick only with thermal infrared imagery and not do anything else. And in a lot of cases, the multispectral, I think worked better. This is, I think, a kind of an example of that. Here, this is from a multispectral camera, the near infrared, and again, this is a thermal infrared. Again, you can see over here kind of a herringbone pattern that's really hard to see anywhere else in other drain line responses, linear features. That here with the near infrared, it just worked a little bit better. So it's worth doing, using all three cameras and then seeing what later when you do the processing, kind of what works out the best. Kind of another example, this is near Pataskala. This is an image from using the red edge. It's kind of at that border between red and near infrared. And this is our thermal infrared camera. But you can pick out a lot of the drainage pipe features maybe a little bit better with the red edge than the thermal infrared. Pardon? Okay. Okay, one more example. This was the again at a site near Chillicothe. But especially these north-south lines we pick up better with the green and the red than we do with the thermal infrared, and with the visible you can't really see it much at all. Not all linear features that you see are going to be drainage pipes. You have to be careful. So here, if you look at this little area down here, you see a lot of linear features that show up really well, but if you look right down here, you see these turnarounds. So that's obviously, those linear features are a result of field operations. So what we need to do is develop criteria, and these are some criteria that I've listed here that, does a drainage pattern seem reasonable, or is that how a contractor would install it? Do you see a herringbone pattern? That's definitely a drainage pipe, pattern there. Spacing distance, is it too narrow to really be drain lines? The pattern's consistent over time. Do you keep seeing it in different images? And finally, are there indications of linear features that are really due to field operations? So this is what our focus is going forward in this coming year. What we want to do is develop guidelines, basically now just going out to sites randomly, develop guidelines on what are the optimal conditions needed for best results in mapping the drainage pipes, whether it's soil type, crop residue, tillage practice, recent rainfall, groundfall wetness, time of day. And then last, we are going to I mentioned that multi-rotor drone. We're going to test it out for being able to map drainage pipe outlets entering into streams, drainage ditches. And that's my end of my presentation.